IVM.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pratik, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I think it's been a remarkably long time since Pratik and I were on the same podcast together, but my name's Rohan Seth and I'm here with Prateek Waghre after an unacceptable amount of time. So welcome to the podcast, Pratik.
Thanks, Rohan.
I think it's nice to say the reason that you're here today with me. It's that you and a co-author have a new paper out at Takshishila's website, and it's called The Governance of DCNs. It's a paper that does categorization of harms. It's a first paper in a series of paper that will explore the governance of digital communication networks. And I think it's quite an interesting time to be talking about these things. So tell us a little bit about this paper.
Yeah, so this is something that and as you mentioned, along with Vishal Ramprasad, who is an alumnus of the Tech and Policy program that we came together and wrote.
Let me actually stop you right there and say that the Tech and Policy program is a program where Pratik teaches, and he's an alumnus of the course itself, as am I. And applications for the program are now open. So, dear listener, if you are into this podcast and like what we talk about, then maybe you like the program itself. Right, sorry about that, Pratik. Go on.
No problem. Yeah. So as I was saying, and as you mentioned, this is part of a longer project that we've undertaken to try and understand, what is the best way to govern these DCNs or digital communication networks, a term that I'll define shortly, right? Which in a way that we maximize the benefits that they offer and minimize the harms, right? And that's sort of where this paper came up. Was the first thing that we wanted to do was go back and study what are the various harms that have been attributed to these digital communication networks, and contextualize them, right? And the reason we felt that important is because if you look at your the adoption of your social media platforms today, right? It's about for all the talk there is, it's still about roughly half the world population has adopted it, right? And if you look at India, right, this is in terms of now internet penetration, we have, even with about 795 million users, we have about 59 connections per people, right? And the point is that there is still significant headroom for growth and adoption of these type of services, which means if we have a set of harms today, there is potential for these to expand in scope. And that's why we thought, okay, look, it makes sense to go back and try and understand them, contextualize them, and that's what basically led to writing this paper.
Right. Let me actually ask you this first because I think it seems like a fairly pertinent question. What exactly are digital content networks and why is this term needed?
Yeah, no, great question. And minor correction: digital communication networks. Always a tricky thing when you're trying to come up with a new term. People will get it wrong.
So I think my preparation for the podcast is just showing at this point. So I'll let you speak now.
Yeah. So as an indicator of sorts, you can think of it as your social media platform, then your messaging services. But we've wanted to expand on that a little bit more, which is why we've defined digital communication networks as a composite entity, which has three components, right? The first being capability, and that's essentially your internet-based products and services, which enable you to communicate instantly across geographic, social, cultural boundaries, right? And at either low cost or for free. And this communication can be one to one, private, one to n, or end to end, right? That sort of thing. The second component are operators, right? And these are now firms or groups, right? That design and operate these products and services. And the reason for that is we don't want to limit it just to private incorporated companies. If there are groups that have come together and made products or services that are being adopted in a similar way. We want, those are something that we want to consider and look at as well. And the third and final component are the networks, right? And these are your entities, groups, or individuals that adopt, right, these products and services. So use this capability in another, to put it another way, to interact with each other. And the idea with doing this is that, again, we don't want to limit ourselves just to the network of one platform or one product that one company has created. The idea is that these networks interact with each other even outside a single product, right? They interact with each other in many ways across many platforms, across many products, right? So we wanted to sort of bring that into consideration as well, right? That's why we came up with we wanted to define this term. Now, another character or two characteristics, right? And this is in common with social media platforms, is that these digital communication networks have low entry costs, right, and a high reliance on user generated content. Right? This is fairly common to like I said earlier, that we have your social media platforms or your messaging services, but okay, you don't want to limit it. Now, to your second part of your question, right? Why do we need a new term, right? Aren't there enough terms already, right? So you have terms like, I've just used a bunch of them multiple times, right? Social media network, social media platforms, big tech, digital platforms, right? And then even things like ICT. So you have a lot of terms out there, right? Now, the reason we wanted to define a new term is that a lot of these, right, are very context dependent. They can be either too broad or too narrow depending on who's using them, where you're using them. In all cases, they tend to leave out certain types of companies or certain types of use cases, right? So the purpose of this framing is essentially to be able to study them, right, from the effect of from the perspective of their effects on societies, right? As as a whole, instead of looking at instead of looking at specific companies or specific types of technologies or specific types of users or modes of interaction, right? The idea is to look at these as a whole, because individual components of these are always evolving, right? And that's what we wanted to bring in an element of future proofing, right? To the extent that's even possible. Yeah, and I think that answers your first one and a half, two questions.
Great, thanks. So let me actually then move on to the classification of harms.
So
So you have,
sorry to interrupt you. I think just something just struck me as a follow on to your your two questions.
sure.
Yeah. So another point to keep in mind is that we looked at so this definition, right? It does come with certain trade offs, and then we're looking specifically at their effects in the spheres of competition and markets, right? Data gathering and narratives in public discourse, right? Now this comes with a couple of trade-offs. The first being that because I use the term digital platform, right? So it's common for people to have an all-encompassing view of that. So I do want to point out that this focus then sort of precludes things like competition in e-commerce marketplaces, right? Or working condition of people in the gig economy. And that's not to say that these problems are not important and not worth consideration. It's just within the framework that we defined and are looking at digital communication networks, those problems are a different set of challenges which need a different set of solutions or interventions, right? And an interesting gray area again is something like the working conditions of content moderation staff. Right now, while content moderation practices are something that we're interested in, because that does heavily have the narrative component of it. The working conditions would probably fall under the gig economy aspect that I spoke about earlier. But it is a gray zone, and we'll have to keep an eye on that as these sort of things evolve. But yeah, sorry, go on.
Right. I actually hadn't thought about that. I think as far as self-awareness of definition goes, I think that's really excellent. So thank you for explaining that. I think before we move on, I mean, I have a few questions regarding the classification bit itself. But before we move on, I think we should take a quick commercial break. So stick around, we'll be right back.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IBM Podcast Network. on the Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast. In the first half, Ashwin is joined by Varun to wrap India's ODI tour of Sri Lanka. In the second half, DJ joins the party to discuss the first T20 international between India and Sri Lanka. If you'd like to hear more about this match, former Indian cricketer Sabha Karim joins Rajiv Mishra on Khel Niti and they talk some more about it. Ladies and gentlemen, we're really excited to announce a new show, a show about crypto with Rohan Joshi. He's going to dive deep and demystify all this crypto stuff that we've been hearing about. And let me tell you a little bit more about stuff that's going on the network really quickly. Congratulations to Maru Kinayat, who celebrates 50 episodes of The Note with a discussion on health as a fundamental right. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam talks to Harsha Chetanwala of mywealthgrow.com. Zarina Poonawala is starting a new miniseries on emotional intelligence. Do check out the kickoff episode on the Empowering series. And Simplified talks about semiconductors. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show, or any other show for that matter, please do tell a friend. That's really helpful for us. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors on the network this week. They make this all possible. Thank you very much, Ciet, Cred, Global Victoria, Bank of Baroda, Intuit India, Lenovo, and CoinSwitch Kuber. We really appreciate your support.
Hi, welcome back to All Things Policy. I'm here with Prateek Waghre talking about his new paper. And Prateek, let's begin with the classification of harms bit of it. So, as a general listener to this podcast, I wonder, this classification of harms thing seems like a fairly technical term, right? And as someone who's read your paper and thoroughly enjoyed it, feel like you've talked about data related harms, narrative harms, competition harms. So tell me about why it's important to classify these harms, and then sort of, let's say, in a top five list that no one ever asked for, tell me which ones are the most pertinent here.
Yeah. Okay. No. So good question. So part of it I covered, right, in the sense that we wanted to have an understanding of these of these harms that have been attributed to the digital communication networks, simply because there seems to be one, there is significant concern about their influence already, and two, that there is still significant potential headroom for further adoption, right? And if you're going to have policy based intervention, then these need to be informed by an understanding or a sound understanding of these harms, which I think we're still getting there, right? I don't think we've completely gotten there yet, but I think we're still getting there. Now, the way we went about doing this is that we looked at things like, let's say, the Digital Services Act or Digital Markets Act, right? They have sections on what they consider the impact, right, of that. The Digital Platforms Inquiry in Australia, right? The US Antitrust Subcommittee report that I think we've done a couple of podcasts on, right? And a number of contributions that various civil society organizations have made in this space, right? And the reason for doing this, right? Now, we could have gone bottom up in terms of just start on the empty canvas and look for the various type of harms, but there is a significant amount of literature there, which we may not have been able to cover. With this approach, I think what we were able to do was, just by virtue of the harms being listed there, it means that they're already in some ways in the public policy conversation, right? Which is why we felt, so that's why we felt that this is one potential way to start, and then we can expand later, as things evolve, right? And as you point out, right? So when we started going through these, three themes sort of became clear. Largely was that there are competition related harms, there are data related harms, and there are narrative aspect harms, right? And I think I won't go into defining exactly what we did. That's in the paper. Now, to your second question of what are the top five, right? Now, I think that's something we specifically avoided because we didn't think it made sense to stack rank these harms, simply because based on context, based on ground realities, how one person or one actor or one organization may interpret something as being a harm could be different from the other. And I don't think that it's our place to stack rank them at this stage. I think it's what we want to do was sort of collate, organize, situate them put them in a place where there is now room for the conversation, where where people can say that, okay, maybe this is the priority we want to take, or hey, you're missing these five, right? And then we could look at adding those. So I know I sort of dodged your question, but it was also a choice that we made, that we did not want to undertake a stack ranking at this stage, simply because it was, I think that there needs to be more conversation around that front.
Right. I think that's an awfully long time to take and then not answer the question. So thank you very much.
I did answer your first question.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Okay. That aside, can you talk to me a little bit about narrative harms? Because I think generally we've talked to death. The competition harms a lot of stuff on this podcast, but the narrative harms themselves haven't been talked about as much. So tell me, what exactly does narrative harm mean, and the impact of it?
Yeah, I think it's important to also think of them first as effects, and then you sort of do a little bit of a value judgment there to say what is a harm, what is not, right? But essentially, what we looked at was, if there is potential to manipulate information flows, right, at a broader societal level, or if there's something that has an impact on public discourse, right? That's sort of the high level idea we had in mind when we started looking at narrative harms, right? And as we went through some of the literature, certain themes emerged. I won't go into a lot of detail into each of these, but I think broadly there were about five, and five not mutually exclusive things, because it again, the way these things affect or impact one aspect very quickly flows into another, right? So it's very hard to put them into mutually exclusive buckets, and I don't think we gain much by doing that, right? But yeah, coming back, so the first one was, whether something could be attributed to the action of a firm operating the DCNs, or something that's just a scaling effect, right? Which is, so for example, something like erroneous content moderation action, right, or taking down content which, and then doing that at a large scale, which affects the ability of a certain group, or a certain vulnerable group, to voice their opinion, right? That you can say that down to an action, because it's down to a policy or just an error, right? As is common, right? We've seen that multiple times, where content is taken down and then they say, oops, it's an error, right? Or versus something that's a scaling effect, where something like the virality of mis and disinformation. Now, these forms of that's always existed, right? But we are now seeing them at a different scale. The other aspect was about incentives that are created, right? So again, this goes back to some of the attention economy stuff, right? So firms want to maximize engagement, right? Participants or networks also want to maximize the engagement that they get, right? But then leads to certain behaviors on their part, right? So there is an added element of performance. For that, you need to tap into tribalism, polarization, right? And then we see this more with I guess we witnessed this, or it's more pronounced with in the politics sphere, especially from the narratives element of it, right? Where there is a celebritization of politics and politicians, and even for them, right? It's about uh, producing that piece of content that help them go viral on social media, right? So you see that shaping of incentives also happening. Very quickly, the remaining are the control and manipulation of information, right? Which is again, like, this goes back to the ability to spread mis and disinformation, things like that. Trust and integrity is, I think, is an important one, because as you see, a lot of low quality information, uh, there is potential for a general lack of trust in information itself, and which has knock-on effects on trust in news media, trust in democratic and scientific institutions, which again is something that we're witnessing, right? And the final is social cohesion. Again, we're sort of seeing that with rising forms of polarization, right? And this is across attitudinal polarization, affective polarization, knowledge polarization, and again goes back to incentives where you have these escalatory or competitive cycles of hate speech, fear mongering, right, incitement, sometimes even physical violence.
Right. I think I just have one more question. Generally, at this stage of the podcast, I would have asked you for your final thoughts and so on. But today, I think I'd like to ask you for a TLDR of the paper. Because if I know if a listener has made it this far and has gotten confused, I can understand why. Because we generally talk about this stuff 24/7, but you might not, dear listener. So, Pratik, tell me the key takeaway from this.
Before I go into that, there's just one more part that I want to talk about, is which is the categorization part, right? So the first, what we spoke about now was just the classification based on competitive data and narrative effects. In the classification part, what we did was we took we tried to categorize them. Sorry, in the categorization part, tried to to put them in terms of, hey, are these potential market failures? Are these potential social problems, and and the types of cognitive biases, right? And I think this was an interesting exercise in the sense that I don't know of too many other papers that have tried to take this on for the entire list. And it was interesting, and this, and again, I won't go into detail, but this leads to the TLDR that you asked for, right? And I think the breadth of the social problems and the type of cognitive biases that we were able to identify, I think that showed us that while we were able to put some of them as categorize some of them as market failures, but it just tells you that, look, competition policy by itself is not going to address all the harms that we were able to collate, right? And some of that is when you consider that those type of interventions are likely to happen, and this is in quotes, likely to happen in certain just certain developed economies. How does that impact multiple countries around the world where we're seeing all these data related narrative harms, right? The social problems and the cognitive biases manifest, right? So that remains a question mark, right? Or that's one takeaway. The other thing that we noticed was, like I said, right, it was the combination of incentives that lead to the ability to manipulate information, lowering trust in institutions, which I think is certainly a serious problem, right, and which has a knock-on effect on social cohesion. On the cognitive biases front, I think again, and what we did, and shout out to Ruturaj, our colleague, who helped us define the the set of cognitive biases to use, and then even to the extent of doing the helping us with the categorization significantly, right? But what we found there was that those associated with tribalism and recency of information had a higher occurrence compared to the others, right? So, and what this means is that our implications, or the implications for public discourse or narratives, goes beyond just whether an information is a piece of information or a message is true or false, right? And that's a statement coming from someone who runs a newsletter called Misdisclosed Information, right? So, and yeah, and I think lastly, the other thing that became apparent to us was that there needs to be further study on the psychosocial effects of these things, especially in the Indian context, right? Because that is something that we did not really come across enough, or any significant amount of literature on. And I think that's something that we need to be doing, and we need to be focusing on. Yes, regulation is one part, but we need to understand the effects that it's having on especially on Indian society, to inform any sort of regulation and interventions we're doing, right? And I think we're already playing catch up on that front.
Right. Thanks for that. Can I just say that with that newsletter plug, that this makes it the first podcast that I haven't plugged anything and you have. So I think my work here is done. But
To be fair, I
thank you so
wasn't
much for.
plugging it. I was making a point, right? About
No, 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 no. I'm not having that. And I don't think I am okay with this, to be honest. But thank you so much for taking the time, Pratik, and telling us about your paper. We'll share the link in the show notes, so please do do take the time out to read it if you can. It's an excellent paper. I highly recommend it as someone who reads everything Pratik writes. Right. Have a nice week ahead, Pratik, and have a nice week ahead, dear listener.
Thanks, man.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Don't you think that if everyone around you is getting smart, you better be smarter? Hey there, I'm the traveling professor Siddharth Deshmukh, and I'm back with season 2 of my podcast to make you smarter. Smarter with Sid. What's this season's focus about? Well, it's about 10-minute nuggets that will make you stand out at work. It's time to go from smart to smarter. Tune in every Tuesday and Thursday and become smarter with Sid.
सफर, रास्ते, मंजिल और मुकाम, अक्सर ये हमसे कुछ कहना चाहते हैं, पर हम हैं कि अपनी रोजमर्रा की जिंदगी में इन्हें सुनने से कतराते हैं। नमस्ते दोस्तों, मेरा नाम है केशव चतुर्वेदी और मैं आपको ले चलूंगा कुछ ऐसे सफर पर जहां आपको एक नया नजरिया मिलेगा सफर और मंजिलों को देखने का। आइए इन किस्से कहानियों में डूब जाएं। हर मंगलवार और शुक्रवार